The feast had been arranged for a celebration, but it looked like a performance. That was the difference between power and court. Power did not need an audience, but court always did. The great hall of Dravenmoor was lit with enough torches to pretend the night was not happening outside. Alpha King Kael Draven sat on the high dais, and the Bloodmoon Crown sat behind him on its pedestal. And the Bloodmoon Crown had not done anything interesting in a very long time. It had not been silent because it was empty. It had been silent because no one had known how to make it speak. Kael did not know this yet. He thought the crown was silent because he was not enough. That thought had been with him for 7 years. Lady Seraphine sat beside him in the formal colors of the Luna candidate position, which was not yet official, but which the council had been treating as settled for the better part of 2 seasons. The jewel at Seraphine's throat was large and luminous, and always seemed to glow just before she spoke, as though announcing itself. It shone steadily tonight, almost too steadily, like a light that had been practiced rather than earned. The feast proceeded the way great hall feasts proceeded, loud in the expected places, quiet in the wrong ones. Elara Vale was in the 3rd corridor from the kitchen, carrying a tray of the 2nd-tier wine that went to the outer tables. She had been a servant in Dravenmoor for 4 years. Before that, she had been in the lower city. Before that, she had been small enough that the things her mother taught her had gone in as feeling rather than information. Her mother had died when Elara was 9. She had left 3 things, a name that meant nothing in the records, because the records had been arranged to make it mean nothing. A coat that was too large and lasted until Elara was 14, and a song. The song had no title her mother had given it, or if it had one, her mother had decided not to say. She had only said, "Remember this." She had only said, "Do not forget." She had not said, "This is the thing that will eventually cause you to be noticed in a way that changes everything. So practice making yourself comfortable with the attention." She had only said, "Remember." Elara had remembered. 4 years in Dravenmoor had taught her how to exist at the edge of attention. She had learned the specific discipline of being seen only when her service required it, and invisible the rest of the time. She was good at it. She had been good at it until 2 months ago, when someone in the kitchen had heard her hum while folding linens and had told someone else, and the description had traveled the way descriptions of anything unusual traveled in a palace, faster than it had any right to, and with additions. Now the court called her the wolfless songbird. They said it the way people said things that were meant to be entertaining at someone's expense. She carried the tray. Nessa was 17. She was carrying a different tray, heavier, because she had only been in the palace for 3 months and had not learned yet that the trick with the heavy trays was in the grip, not the arms. She was moving too fast because Seraphine's table had run low, and speed was the only compensation available when you could not yet predict the pace of the room. The tray tilted. The wine went over the tablecloth. Several quarts of red Valorian vintage spread across the formal linen and the sleeve of the nobleman seated at the end. Nessa said she was sorry. She said it in the small, breathless voice of someone who understood that sorry was not going to be enough. Seraphine looked at the wine. Then she looked at Elara. She said, "Perhaps our wolfless songbird would be willing to perform for the feast, as a gesture of goodwill for the disruption her staff has caused." She said it with the pleasant precision of someone who had thought of the exact cruelty and was delivering it in a container that looked like generosity. She said, "Let the wolfless songbird sing for us." The table nearest the door went quiet. The quiet spread. Kael watched this happen with the expression he wore when he was calculating something and had not yet reached a conclusion. He had seen this kind of court maneuver before. He had seen cruelty dressed in the language of entertainment so many times that he had learned not to engage until he understood the mechanics. He was still calculating when Elara set down her tray. She said, clearly enough for the nearby tables to hear, "If I do not sing, what happens to the girl who spilled the wine?" Seraphine's smile did not move. She said the girl would be properly addressed for the disruption. Kael stopped calculating. He understood the mechanics now. Kael had mistaken cruelty for court theater until Elara named the punishment hidden beneath it. The distinction was this. Court theater was cruel because it was thoughtless. What Seraphine had arranged was cruel because it was designed. Elara looked at Nessa. Nessa was holding the empty tray. She was not yet crying, which was the specific bravery of someone who had decided they were not going to give the room the satisfaction. Elara said, "I do not sing to entertain you. I sing because if I am silent, you will punish someone weaker than me." She walked to the front of the hall. She stood in the space before the high dais. She was wearing a servant's uniform and practical boots, and her hair in the order it had been in when she was carrying trays. She was not dressed for performance. She had the specific dignity of someone who had not been given the option of preparation and had decided that preparation was beside the point. The court watched her. With the expression it wore when it expected to be amused, she began to sing. The song had no title she knew of. It was the song her mother had taught her when she was small, in the way mothers taught songs to small children, by repetition, by patience, by making the melody familiar enough that it settled into the places in a person where things were kept without being chosen. Her mother, Elara Vale, had taught her the words the way you taught a child something important by making it sound like something ordinary. Elara had thought it was a lullaby. She had thought this for 22 years. The first 3 notes left her mouth, and the torches in the great hall went out. Not gradually, not one by one. All of them, simultaneously, as though the light had been a single thing and it had decided to stop. The hall went dark, except for the moon coming through the high windows. And then the wolves changed. The wolves that noble guests had brought, the formally presented pack companions standing at the far wall, went from the controlled dignity of animals at court to something older. They went down, not aggressively, not out of fear. In the way that things went down, when they recognized something they had not encountered before, and their bodies knew the appropriate response before their minds caught up. Behind Kael, on the pedestal where it had been silent for 100 years, the Bloodmoon Crown began to move. Not physically, but something in it changed. It was the way a room changed when someone important entered it. A pressure shift, a reorientation of attention, and then light came from the crown. Not torchlight, not the steady shine of Seraphine's relic. Something that moved with the quality of moonlight on water. Uncontrolled, responsive, alive. It ran down the face of the crown in lines that were not random. It ran like script, like something being written, or like something that had already been written and was now being given the chance to be read. Elara was still singing. She did not stop for the darkness, or for the wolves, or for the crown. She had come here to make sure Nessa did not get punished for a tilted tray. She had not expected any of the rest. She kept singing. The crown kept answering. Seraphine said witchcraft before the crown had finished its first line. She said it clearly, and to the room rather than to any specific person, which was the technique for making a statement function as consensus. She said the servant had hexed the room, that this was exactly the kind of irregular, wolfless magic the court should have been guarding against. Kael stood up. He said, "Stop." He said it once, in the voice he used when once was all he was going to say. The guard who had started moving toward Elara stopped. Kael walked to the pedestal, where the crown was running its moonlit lines. He had been in rooms with the crown for 7 years. He had been in this specific room for every oath ceremony, and every formal session and every night feast where the crown's presence was required for legitimacy. He had been here for the Bloodmoon rituals that the council had arranged and that had produced nothing except the uncomfortable feeling that the silence of the crown was something he was supposed to pretend not to notice. He had been here for Seraphine's formal blessing displays, where the relic at her throat would warm and she would speak the words, and the court would watch, and the crown would not respond, and everyone would behave as though this was normal. He had been here for all of it. 7 years of ceremonies had taught him the shape of the crown's silence. He had been crowned in this room. He had stood here for every formal ceremony, and every public oath, and every night, when the weight of a kingdom that was quietly losing its blessing kept him awake. The crown had never done this. Not for him. Not for the oaths of office. Not for Seraphine's formal blessing performances, where the relic at her throat glowed warmly, and she spread her hands and said the words the council had coached her to say. He looked at Elara, who had stopped singing, because the hall had gone so quiet that continuing felt different from what she had started. He looked at the crown. He said to the room, "This is not witchcraft. This is the crown responding, which is something I need to understand before anyone goes anywhere." He looked at Seraphine. He said, "Demonstrate the blessing." Seraphine walked to the crown's position. She touched the relic. She began the words of blessing the council had approved, the formal invocation that was meant to confirm her connection to the crown's light. The crown did not respond. The lines of moonlight it had written for Elara faded while Seraphine's spoke. By the time she finished, the crown was dark again. Not silent in the way it had been before. Silent in a different way. The way silence felt when something had been demonstrated. The jewel at Seraphine's throat flared, then dimmed. It flared in the space where a response should have been. It dimmed when the response did not come. Elara said, "When the crown goes quiet, you call it a sacred relic. When it answers me, you call me dangerous." Varric said she should be detained for examination. Kael said she should not. He said there was a room in the North Tower that had been closed since his grandfather's reign, and that he was going to open it, and that anyone who objected was welcome to explain to him why a closed room and a servant girl who made the crown respond warranted more alarm than 100 years of silence. No one explained this to him. He ordered the North Tower opened. Healer Rowan had been in the feast as an observer, the way healers attended formal events. Not as guests, not as staff, but as the specific category of person who was present in case something went wrong, and who was hoping nothing did. Something had gone wrong in a way he had not prepared for. He found Elara in the corridor outside the Great Hall. He asked to see the back of her ear. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because the crown reaction to a vocal bloodline leaves a specific mark in the same location on every carrier I have ever read about. And I have been reading about this for 15 years, because I suspected the record was not complete." She let him look. The mark was there. A shape like a musical note drawn in the form of a crescent moon, silver under the skin, the kind of mark that did not appear from external cause. The kind that came from inside. He said, "You are not wolfless in the sense of lacking something. You have a different bloodline," he said. "Your wolf is a voice." The North Tower room had been locked with 3 different keys from 3 different generations of the Draven line, which was the kind of security that said, this was locked by people who disagreed with each other about whether it should ever be opened, and they had compromised on making it difficult. Inside was the music. Not literally, but the room contained everything that had been removed from the official archive. When the Council of Kael's grandfather's time had decided that certain histories were inconvenient, there was a family tree for the Moon Singer line. At the bottom of it, before the line was cut, was the name Elara Vale. Below that, in handwriting that was different from the rest, added later, carefully, by someone who had found the record and needed to leave a mark that would not be obvious unless you were looking. Elara. There was sheet music. The song Elara had sung was notated in full. At the top of the page, in the old formal language, 2 words, "Curse Path." And below the notation, in a different ink, in a hand she recognized from old letters her mother had left, "And Judgment Path, if you have the choice. Choose the second. Daughter. The first will burn down everything, including the people who did nothing." She had been holding the page for a long time before she realized Kael was reading it over her shoulder. He said, "Your mother knew this was here. It was not a question," she said. "She knew everything here. She put that note there," he said. She hid a command inside a lullaby, because lullabies were the only songs no guard thought to confiscate. He said it quietly, the way people said things they had just understood. They found the massacre record in the hatch, below the pedestal room. It was not dramatic. It was a council document, dry and administrative, recording the decision to remove the Moonsinger bloodline from the court. The language was careful. The language was careful in the specific way. That language was careful when the people writing it knew what they were doing was wrong, and wanted the record to make it look like policy. Kael read it. He read it a second time. He said, "The Crown had not abandoned Dravenmoor. Dravenmoor had murdered the voices that knew how to ask it why." He said it like someone confirming something he had suspected and had hoped was not true. Varric convened a council session before the morning. He brought 4 council members and a legal argument about authority over magical artifacts found on palace grounds. He said the servant girl had activated something she did not understand. He said that whatever the Crown had responded to was not legitimate, because legitimate Moonsinger bloodlines had been documented as extinct. He said, "Truth is useful only when it kneels to order." Elara was in the room. She had been invited by Kael, which was one of the things Varric objected to. Varric said, "A crown that answers a servant is no crown at all." Elara said, "Then perhaps what you have been calling a crown is only a ring that knows to obey the powerful." Seraphine was also in the room. She was wearing the relic. She did not touch it while Elara was speaking. Rowan had spent the hours between the feast and the council session, examining the relic with the tools he had available. He said the relic contained a voice echo. He said a voice echo was the preserved resonance of a Moonsinger's call, extracted from its source by force and sealed into an object. He said, "Seraphine has spent her life learning how to look blessed. Elara was born with the one thing that blessing cannot imitate, a voice the Crown remembered." Seraphine said the healer was making accusations without authority. Kael said, "Then demonstrate the blessing again, in this room, with both of you present." Seraphine reached for the relic. The relic's light wavered. One heartbeat too late, she said the words. The crown, which Kael had brought into the council chamber on its pedestal, did not respond. Not one line, not one movement. Elara said, "Nothing." The crown said enough, without her. Varric said the servant should be confined while the council deliberated. He said Nessa should also be examined. He said this in the smooth procedural tone of someone who had learned that confining people you did not like was easier if you framed it as examination. Elara looked at Nessa, who was standing in the doorway. Because Kael had told the council that excluding servant witnesses was not going to happen today. She understood what Varric was doing. She understood it very specifically because she had been in this palace for 4 years, and she knew how the machinery worked. She knew that if she sang the curse path in the next 5 minutes, she could bring down the oath structure of the entire court. She also knew that the people who had done nothing, Nessa, the servants, the pack oath holders, in the border territories who depended on royal vow protections, would lose their protections in the collapse. She had learned this from the note her mother had left. She had the choice. She was going to use it. Kael arranged the session in the Great Hall, not in the council chamber, not in any room where the door could be controlled by the people who wanted the door controlled. The Great Hall, open to the court, with the Bloodmoon Crown on its pedestal at the center. He stood on the floor, not the dais. He said to the assembled court, "I have been told for 7 years that the Crown's silence was a spiritual condition. I am now informed that it was a political one. There is a difference. I intend to find out which things in this kingdom's record have the same distinction." Varric said the Crown should not be activated by someone without formal verification. Kael said, "The Crown activated without my permission and without formal verification. It has now been shown not to respond to the formal verification process at all. I am open to arguments about what that means, but they will need to be better than the ones I have heard so far." Seraphine made one more attempt. She stood before the Crown in her full formal Luna garments. She pressed the relic. She began the blessing words. The relic cracked. Not all the way. A single line, running from the setting at the bottom to the stone at the top. The light inside it stopped being steady and began to pulse. The pulsing was uncontrolled in the way that things were uncontrolled when the mechanism keeping them controlled had been compromised. Kael said, "I will not ask you to save my throne from the truth that built it." He was looking at Elara. He had placed his sword on the floor when he came down from the dais. He said, "The crown's judgment is the crown's. I will stand under it like anyone else." Elara stood before the crown. She thought about the people she was holding in her hands right now, without having chosen to hold them. She thought about her mother, who had hidden a command inside a lullaby, and had written "choose the second daughter" at the bottom of a page no one was supposed to find. She thought about Nessa standing in the doorway. She thought about the border pacts and the servant oaths, and the people who had done nothing wrong and would lose everything if the oath structure collapsed. She thought about burning it down. She thought about it the way you thought about something you had every right to do, and were choosing not to. Honestly, without pretending torch was easy. The curse path would take the false oaths with it. It would also take the real ones. The servants who had nothing to do with any of this would lose the oath protections that kept them from being dismissed without cause. The border pack families who had sworn fealty in good faith would lose the vow structures their children depended on. The thing about burning down the people who hurt you was that fire did not distinguish. Her mother had known this. Her mother had left her a choice because her mother had understood that the only difference between a voice used for judgment and a voice used for revenge was what happened to the people who hadn't done anything wrong. She said, "I will not let their crime teach my voice to become theirs." She sang. Not the curse path, the judgment path. It was different from the first song. The first song had been a greeting, or the crown had taken it as one. The judgment path was a question, or it was many questions, or it was the specific kind of sound that made things that had been buried have to answer. The crown's light came back, stronger than before. Lines of moonwriting moved across the floor, up the walls, across the ceiling. The crown did not create evidence. It answered records the court had buried. It answered the massacre record. It answered the false Luna vow Seraphine had made, and the source of the relic's voice. It answered Varric's instructions to archive healers about what not to record. It answered the blood tax oaths that had been applied to pack families without consent. It answered all of it. The relic at Seraphine's throat sputtered and went dark. The fake blessing disappeared in the same way it had always been working, not from the inside out, but from the outside in. She had never been blessed. She had been wearing the sound of someone else's voice and calling it her own. Varric said this was being done by a servant without authority. The crown wrote one word in moonlight on the floor, 4 feet high, in the old formal script. Voice, not a title given by the king, not a rank assigned by the council. The crown's own record, written in the crown's own language, naming what it had found. Elara sang the last line. She sang it holding the oath protections for the border pacts, for servant contracts, for the children whose futures depended on vows made above their heads that they had never been asked to consent to. She cut the false oaths. She held the true ones. The hall went quiet in the way. It went quiet when something large had shifted, and the world needed a moment to find its new shape. Varric was removed from council authority before the morning. Seraphine's Luna candidacy was formally ended by a council motion that passed 6-0. Seraphine had not asked for a vote. She had left the hall when the relic went dark and had not come back. There was something there, not sympathy, exactly, but the understanding that she had been a product of a system that taught women to perform blessedness rather than carry it, and that dismantling the system was the right response, not simply removing the woman it had created. Kael said, in the formal record that was being written, Dravenmore did not lose its blessing. It lost the voices that knew how to ask the crown why. The record will reflect that. The record will reflect everything. he arranged. The formal restoration of the Moon Singer name to the palace archive, the opening of the locked music room to public record, the investigation of all beneficiaries of the Moon Singer massacre, the formal dissolution of Seraphine's candidacy, and new servant protections written into the oath structure that the crown had confirmed rather than cut. Elara said, when he told her what the crown had named her, "If you tell me the crown's naming is your gift, this court will take it back when it becomes inconvenient." Kael said, "Then let the record say the crown answered you before I did." She held that. She had been carrying things since she was small. A lullaby, that was a command, a name she did not know she had, a silence the court had taught her to maintain. She was done maintaining it. She said, "Then write it that way. Crown first, you second." He wrote it that way. 1 month later, the great hall was lit with enough torches to pretend the night was not happening outside. Some things did not change, but the crown was no longer silent on its pedestal. It ran a faint line of moonwriting along its edge, steady and quiet, like something that had been waiting for a long time and had recently found it did not need to wait anymore. Elara stood before it, not behind it. Kael stood to the side, not above her, not behind her. He had put the sword on the floor in this room once, and he had decided that was the right distance to stay at until she said otherwise. Nessa was in the hall. She was not carrying a tray. She was standing with the other servants who had come to see what the hall looked like when the crown was lit, and no one was pretending it wasn't. None of them were looking at the floor. They had forced her to sing as a joke, expecting a servant's shame to entertain the court. But when Elara opened her mouth, the Bloodmoon Crown remembered the voices buried beneath its throne, and the girl they mocked became the song no king would ever silence again.